you for attending this afternoon session. It's been a wonderful morning for those of you who are here, I think most of you. So it is my honor to present to you three renowned scholars who are going to engage us this afternoon. But first off, I have a few announcements to make in terms of how we're going to do things slightly different from what we did in the morning. We're going to have the three panelists make their presentations, and immediately after, over to you guys. You're going to ask questions, and then we leave time for them at the end. So we're not asking questions right to the end. We're going to leave a bit of time at the very end for the scholars to ask each other questions. So they won't have to ask the questions you asked. They will be asking different set of questions. Does that sound good?
Yes.
Okay, thanks to Bill for okaying that. So first off, we have Agnes Brazal. She's an associate professor of theology at DePaul University in Manila, in the Philippines. She's also the past president and founding member of DDL, which is the theological, Catholic Theological Society of the Philippines, and one of the first coordinators of MAPOS, of the Ecclesia of Women in Asia, which is an association of Catholic women in Asia. She has been a planning committee member of the Catholic Theological Ethics in the World Church since 2007, so that's a huge one. And editorial board member of journals, Catholic Studies, Asian Christian Review, and Buddhi. And an international advisory board member of Event Studies, where she got a PhD. And she has published, among things, several articles in the three journals, and has been a co-editor and a co-author of 2 books, and you get the books on the flyer chairs. So help me to welcome Agnes Brazal.
Pope Francis has encouraged theologians to contribute to an up-to-date theology of women, toward a more incisive female presence in the church that is beyond their current role in parishes. Some women theologians, however, reject the concept of a theology of women that implies a dualistic gender complementarity and instead call for a more robust theology of the laity. To speak of a theology of the laity, or an ecclesiology of the laity, is, however, fundamentally problematic. The role of the laity can only be construed in relation to the clergy, and together they compose the people of God. Furthermore, an inclusive ecclesiology cannot start from the clergy-lay distinction as an ontological status, and the dualistic differentiation of the domain of the clergy as intra-ecclesial and that of the laity as extra-ecclesial. What we need is a shared ecclesiological vision under which both the ordained and the laity, men and women, are viewed as equal partners in church ministries. The Federation of Asian Bishops Conference and its offices have developed a theology of harmony, and through its Theological Advisory Commission, has spoken of the church as communion of communities that is also a sacrament of harmony. However, it has not adequately developed this to include as well the genuine participation of laity in the church and of women in particular. In my presentation, I shall argue that the Yinyang symbolism possesses potential to reimagine man-woman, cleric-lay, and other dualities in the church as fluid polarities, and enrich the FABC vision of church as sacrament of harmony. I will employ discourse analysis and Avery-Dallas framework to examine the model of church as sacrament of yin-yang harmony, its goal or ultimate purpose, beneficiaries, and the bonds that unite the members, as well as evaluate it based on the 6 criteria as shown in the slide. A church still in need of renewal. The Vatican II teaching is a great improvement from the pre-conciliar view of the laity as passive recipients of the clergy's pastoral initiatives. Signs of a movement toward a new ecclesiology founded not on the clergy-lay distinction, but on the primacy of baptism and discipleship can be discerned. However, as Giovanni Magnani expresses it, it is still largely characterized as contrastive theology that regards the laity sphere as basically the secular world, while that of the clergy is the church. There are, however, fissures in the understanding of this clergy-lay distinction. For example, Lumen Gentium 33 has noted that the laity can also be called in various ways to a more direct form of cooperation in the apostolate of the hierarchy. The 1983 Code of Canon Law lists many possibilities for ministry of lay persons within the church, as listed in the slide. Pastor bonus also allows lay people's appointment at the Roman Curia as consultors, senior administrators, or officials. In these functions or offices, lay persons for the most part can only make their opinions known. They do not have the power to vote or to decide, because Canon 129 restricts the power of governance only to those who have been ordained. Furthermore, many of these roles are still in the hands of the ordained, and if lay persons are appointed, they are mostly men. The persistence of a bias is rooted not only in the dualistic and contrastive theologies of clergy and laity, but also of male and female, as seen in Vatican II and post-Vatican II teachings of Paul VI, John Paul II, and Benedict XVI on gender complementarity. Francis does not depart from the teachings of his predecessors, although Michael Lawler and Todd Sussman see him as nuancing complementarity. Whether this more nuanced view would in actual practice translate to granting the laity and especially women official governing and teaching functions remains to be seen. On the one hand, Francis dismissed both the possibility of appointing women cardinals, saying that this is falling into clericalism, even if there had been lay cardinals before, and the proposal for a woman to head a dicastery, remarking that this would be simple functionalism. Echoing John Paul II, he underlines that the essential role of women consists in the expression of the feminine genius. On the other hand, he also set up a commission to study the history of women deacons in the early church, and should he decide to ordain women deacons, a study commission member Phyllis Agano notes that this can pave the way, not necessarily toward women's ordination, but for women assuming governing functions in the church. Though not addressing the above issues directly, the FABC model of church as communion of communities aims to foster dialogue and participation within the church and with outside groups. The three marks of the church, of this church, are: it is participatory, dialogical, and prophetic. A participatory church acknowledges the gifts of the Holy Spirit to all the faithful, lay, religious, and cleric alike. A dialogical church engages with people of other faiths and persuasions in a dialogue of life towards the integral liberation of all. FABC 5 underlines that this dialogue should start from within, and if the youth, women, and the poor remain voiceless, then this dialogue beyond church boundaries will remain deeply flawed. A prophetic church, in turn, proclaims the values of God's reign. It critiques and transforms unjust structures and redress imbalances based on these values. The Church's communion is also a sacrament of harmony. The Vatican II documents clearly identify the Church as a fundamental sacrament. For the FABC, the Church is not only a sacrament of Christ, but of the harmony that Christ brings forth. I quote, "Harmony seems to constitute, in a certain sense, the intellectual and affective, religious and artistic, personal and societal soul of both persons and institutions in Asia," unquote. Harmony can be manifested at different levels: intrapersonal, cosmic, social, and global. Whereas communion is usually linked to the one body in Christ with many parts, the image that harmony conveys is that of the blending together of a plurality. My argument is that this vision of church as sacrament of harmony can be enriched further by the Yinyang concept of integration. In many East Asian cultures, harmony is believed to be the fruit of a balance and blending of fluid dualities. In Taoism, the Tao is usually represented in the form of Taiji, which symbolizes the two generative forces in the universe, yin and yang. All beings possess the duality of yin-yang. Religious Taoism seeks harmony through interior practices that refine one's bodily ki, the source of vitality, harmony, creativity, and moral courage. The imbalance of yin-yang can affect the flow of ki and produce chaos or illness, believed to be rooted in a blocked ki. The earliest source of yin-yang discourse is the Book of Changes, or I Ching. Yang means sun, while yin means absence of sun, illustrated as a hill with a shady, cool, moist, less active, and a sunny side, warm, dry, and more active. As the sun moves, the hill is transformed. The yin side becomes yang, and the yang becomes yin. More than just a fixed character of things, yin and yang refer to structures and functions in specific and relative contexts. In its original meaning, it referred to the function of the sun in relation to a hill, the sunny and shady side. In its dependence on context, something can be simultaneously yin and yang vis-a-vis multiple relations. This comparison to a hill with a sunny and shady side shows how its later abstraction into the well-known symbol of the Taiji is oversimplified and unable to demonstrate the fluidity of yin-yang. Chinese scholar Robin Wang describes 6 ways of conceiving the relationship of yin-yang: contradiction and opposition. Opposite qualities of yin-yang are relative. That is, they are only so in relation to something. Compared to the sun, the moon is yin, but compared to the night sky, the moon is yang. Interdependence. Opposites cannot exist without the other. There is no up, yang, without a down, yin. Another meaning refers to how things exist, grow, and function. The sun rises, yang, but also sets, yin. Mutual inclusion. Yang always entails yin and vice versa, as illustrated in the symbol of the Taiji. And the yang has a dot of yin, and yin has a dot of yang. Interaction. A change in one will cause a change in the other. As darkness, yin, sets in, the light, yang, fades away. Complementary or mutual support. Each side provides what is lacking in the other. Activity, yang, is completed by receptivity, yin. Exchange and transformation. Each side of the duality transforms and changes into the other in an endless cycle. Just as in nature there is a time of decline and decay, there is also a period of growth, reproduction, and flourishing. So a common thread in these 6 ways of conceiving the yin-yang relation is that things are neither purely yin nor yang. These forces continually interact, symbolizing harmony within creative tension, and that reality is in a process of constant transformation. The gendering of yin-yang occurred in the period of Dongzong Shu, founder of Imperial Confucianism, that is a merging of yin-yang theory and Confucianism. In the process, many of the earlier features, such as its fluidity, have been lost, as Zongshu's interpretation favors yang over yin. This occurred at a period when there was a need for a unity ideology that would promote the emperor's authority over the empire and provide a hierarchical cosmology that kept everything in its proper place and order under the emperor. So you see that yang is the masculine aspect now, and yin is the feminine aspect. The yin-yang metaphor has been used in theological discourses. For Jungyang Lee, the Taiji allows us to look at reality in terms of both and, where opposites get harmonized, instead of the either-or way of thinking rooted in Greek dualism. In a non-essentializing understanding of yin-yang, each person of the Trinity can be viewed as possessing both yin and yang qualities. The source of all being is yin in its unknowableness and yang in its function as creator. The Son, incarnated in the historical Jesus, exhibits yin in his prayerful contemplation, receptivity, to please for healing, and Yang in his active promotion of God's reign, and anger at those who would place unnecessary restrictions to the true worship of God. The Spirit manifests Yin in its receptiveness, quiescence, and Yang in its impelling role in Jesus' life, its ability to raise Jesus from the dead, and in the formation or the formation of the early church. From another perspective, Grace G. Sun Kim argues that Ki is the Spirit in the Asian context. Both God and Ki are the first cause from which everything proceeds. Just as God breathed into Adam, ancient people in East Asia believed that all beings, and heaven and earth, breathed Ki. The balance of yin-yang within the person, society, the cosmos, allows the free flow of Ki, the great harmony, the Spirit. In the Bible, shalom, which goes with justice, is the concept closest to the yin-yang vision of harmony. Jesus sought to redress social-religious injustice brought about by cultic purity laws. This does not mean exclusion of those who are honored in society, the wealthy, or those who are happy. Instead, what is being done is balancing the imbalance, so the Spirit Ki will flow unimpeded. Yin-yang harmony in humanity. The reading of humanity from a yin-yang lens has been shaped in the past by the complementary theo-anthropological perspective, where the female is identified only with yin and the male with yang, and the two together, co-humanity, as that which image God's yin-yang. This is similar to John Paul II's caution in Mulieris Dignitatem that the struggle for women's equality should not lead to women's masculinization. Those who would hold that men are essentially yang but with a dot of yin, and women are essentially yin with a dot of yang, reflect the less rigid view of femininity masculinity of Ratzinger, for whom women are more associated with femininity, read as the capacity for the other, but which even men can exhibit. In contrast to these earlier meanings of yin-yang, yin and yang actually take a more fluid perspective. Not one gender is viewed as essentially yin nor yang. Yin-yang are functions in certain contexts and not fixed characteristics. The Church's model of yin-yang harmony suggests that no one group, male or female, clergy or lay, can be stereotyped as assuming greater yang, active, or yin, passive roles within the church and the secular sphere. In their participation in ministries, their yin-yang can be in constant transformation, with some active in certain ministries more than in others. The goal or purpose of this church model is to maintain harmony between the diverse groups within the church, the world, and the cosmos. Where there is imbalance of yin and yang, or injustice ad intra or ad extra, the flow of the Spirit Ki is blocked. Structures of church governance, teaching, and sanctification need to be reformed to become more inclusive and balanced. Ecclesiologists such as Paul Lakeland and Ormond Rush, for instance, have provided us with concrete visions for renewal and reform in church governance and the church teaching office. Lakeland proposes election of representatives from various ministries to the parish council, which he proposes to be a deliberative and not just a consultative body. Accountability of ordained servant leaders to the pastoral council, involvement of lay people in the selection of bishops, and placing qualified lay people in diocesan administration and the curia. Ormond Rush, on the other hand, proposes to envision the church teaching office as involving more than the magisterium, but instead would have three distinctive authorities: the sensus fidelium, theology, and the magisterium. Lay people, such as catechists and members of BECs, are engaged in the interpretation, application, and transmission of the faith. Theologians, men and women, clergy and lay, assist in the creative interpretation of scripture and tradition in new contexts. The much earlier proposal of Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza to institutionalize the dialogue of the magisterium with the theologians through the creation of theological commissions on the diocesan, national, regional, and international levels may be helpful in this regard. The beneficiaries of this model of church as yin-yang harmony are the marginalized, both inside and outside the church, who find the need, support, and empowerment. The bonds that unify members is the same bond that link them to the bigger society and the cosmos. Ki, the fundamental energy at life source that is present in each human. The model and Dallas 6 criteria. The model of church as sacrament of yin-yang harmony is strong in fostering a corporate identity and mission, especially for East Asians who can culturally identify with the yin-yang discourse, as well as among an increasing number of Christians who are appropriating Asian spirituality. It likewise opens up other possibilities for the production of a creative and fruitful theology by women and the laity. Enhanced by the biblical concept of harmony, it is able to foster as well virtues such as equality, justice for the marginalized, and care for creation. It is a church at the service of the restoration of the whole of creation in its original harmony. The model possesses potential for positive relations among church members, as it redresses imbalances caused, for instance, by clericalism and sexism within the church. It is open as well to the presence of grace outside church institutions. The Second Plenary Assembly Statement of the FABC affirms the presence of the Holy Spirit in other religions, and that the Holy Spirit has taught other religions to express their faith in a marvelous variety of ways. As key is the great harmony which makes possible harmonies of opposites, it can be employed to foster acceptance of the other, especially the marginalized other. Though the term harmony is not in the Bible itself, it constitutes one of the major themes in Christianity, akin to the salvation offered by God through Christ Jesus. The patristic tradition likewise anticipates the notion of the church as sacrament of harmony. In the context of a threat of schism in the church, Saint Cyprian writes of the church as a sacrament of unity. In the Christian perspective, however, the church can only be truly a sacrament of harmony if it is in communion with a perfect personal relationship in the Trinity, the source and summit of harmony. Unlike in the Taoist perspective, where yin-yang and qi are impersonal forces, the Trinity is a personal God. This relationship of love with the personal God, according to FABC, is a Christian contribution to the concept of harmony in East Asia. Yin-yang's Taoist origins may also connote for others passivity in the face of conflict to promote harmony at all costs. In Taoism, to live harmoniously with the natural world, one should never go against its rhythms, never fight with one's emotions and desires. The Tao Te Ching, however, does not foster withdrawal from the world. Harmony is achieved via active waiting or a wait-and-see stance, and is focused on what one is to do and how to steer the course of events quietly and inconspicuously. However, an important complement to this active waiting stance is the prophetic dimension in Christianity that stresses the countercultural and critical role of religion vis-a-vis structures of oppression. The bishops warn against idyllic peace or sinful counterfeit harmony in society that simply serves vested interests and egoistic goals. It is the poor and the excluded who bear the cost of this kind of harmony. Concluding remarks. The Vatican II teachings, though a great advance compared to the pre-Vatican II two-tiered church, does not provide for an adequate ecclesiology that would open up a space for the full participation of the laity and of women in particular. In this essay, we have proposed the church as sacrament of yin-yang harmony, as an ecclesiological model in the East Asian context. It builds on the FABC theology of harmony and vision of church as sacrament of harmony. It offers a way of reimagining the roles of women and men, laity and clergy in the church beyond complementary polarities based on essential difference. This model emphasizes fluid dualities whose equal and balanced participation in the church would enable her to truly become a sacrament of harmony. Thank you.
for reminding us about the balance between the yin and the yang, and that it's a natural balance. We wouldn't be here if that was the reality. Next, we welcome Neomi, DeAnda, who is a Jain scholar, an activist, and a Catholic Marianist, serving as assistant professor of religion at the University of Dayton. She holds a PhD in constructive theology, and her research interests include Latinas and Latin American women writers in religion between 1600 and 1900, Christology. I was struck by theology and breast milk. Really fascinated by the courses and the research areas there. I hope we'll get to hear a bit of that. He currently serves as the academic at the Academy of Catholic Hispanic Theologians in the United States, and is its vice president. Her honors include Louisville Institute First Book for Minority Scholars Grants and fellowships in Hispanic Theological Initiatives in the Wabash Center for Teaching and Learning in Religion and Theology. Neomi gives much credit for her work to the roots of St. Pius, the 10th Catholic community in El Paso, in St. Mary's University in San Antonio, in Texas. It is important, I think, to realize that she was raised between El Paso and Corpus Christi. Help me to welcome her.
Thank you very much. I did not create a beautiful PowerPoint, so we'll just leave the closing remarks up there until my closing remarks. Thank you to everyone who is here today and to all who worked to put this together. Thank you especially to Karen Kraft, who kept after me to make sure I submitted something, and to my brother Michael, who came today, who lives here in town but came to see me, so that's always sweet. My heart is actually torn because today, right about now, maybe it's already complete, but my godson was confirmed in El Paso, Texas, and our dad is his sponsor, so yeah, my heart's a little bit torn at the moment, but we'll get over it. That's part of life, right? So, as was said in my introduction, I focus on Latinas here in the United States, as well as histories of Latinas and Latin American women, 16 to 1900. And I do that for a number of reasons. First, and this is not my preference of the term Latino, Latina, but I'm going to use Latino, Latina for clarity rather than other terms that may be used like Latinoa or Latinx, but I think those terms get kind of jargony, and then there's going to be all these questions, and so I'm just going to keep it rather simple for today. So the reasons I do some of this historical research begin because Latinos and Latinas here in the USA are often portrayed as recent arrivals. And the fact remains that the USA border crossed us many years ago. For many Latinos and Latinas in the USA, to be Americano really means to be part of two continents. It's an identity that crosses multiple borders. As continual racializations perpetuate myths of Latinos and Latinas as recent arrivals and violent aggressors, and don't even get me started on the border situation and the National Guard, but if you want to ask about that in the Q&A, feel free. Latina leadership in civic, church, and academic life remains stunted. And as an example of this, so I'm from the Mexico-USA border, and when Pope Francis went to Juarez in 2016, he had two women speak, which was amazing because they actually set the precedent for what was going to be said, and then he responded to what they said. What was more amazing was that their speeches were never translated into any other languages. And so, well, not at that time and not by the Vatican. So the Pope's remarks were all transcribed, and they were all translated into multiple languages, and you can find them on the Vatican website. But the writings of the two women were not. You can still find the videos for them. So it's a bit of a shameless self-promotion, but really because we were talking about translations, and I think this continues to be an issue. You can find those two speeches translated. They're published on the Political Theology blog, but you can find them translated on my website, neomi.DeAnda.com. So just put my two first and last name together.com. There's a tab. It takes you to the videos and the translations and the transcriptions of Francis's words as well. But that's just one example of how systematic pieces work to continue to stifle women's voices and women's leaderships, even when we are placed in international platforms. So among the misperceptions about Latinas and Latin American women is the thought that few historical role models and leaders exist. And this is really why I do this work of translation of historical women, because the retrieval and translation into English from these voices is extremely important. And it's not just important for the church, but also for the academy, and it's not just important for religion and theology, but for a whole host of other disciplines. But the ability for people to say, well, there are no historical role models, can continue to perpetuate that stereotype of Latinos and Latinas, especially Latinas, are recent arrivals. So if we're able to bring these historical trajectories and tie them together, then at least we can combat some of that thought of being recent arrivals. And that's why I do the work that I do. So today I'm going to tell you a little bit about a Dominican nun. Well, she eventually ended up as a Dominican nun. And Barbara Reed let me know today that I look very Dominican. So shout out on that. Really, I was going for Olivia Pope, for those of you who watch Scandal, but either one is wonderful. So, Sor Maria Agueda de San Ignacio, who lived between 1695 and 1756, published Maravillas del Divino Amor, selladas con el sello de la verdad. And these were published actually posthumously in Puebla, Mexico, in 1758. Maria Ana offers an 18th century theology based on El Camino de la Leche, or the Milky Way. And this is actually where my work on breast milk began, was looking at her. Her writings exist today because her bishop, and talking about loving titles, Señor D. Domingo Pantaleón Áviles de Abreu, paid for the publication of her text soon after her death. I engage Mariana, her work in general, and the image of breast milk in particular, as a Latina, specifically a Tejana, and feminist. As Maria Pilar Aquino states, quote, "The third task of Latina feminist theology is that of more deeply connecting theology and spirituality in feminist terms," end quote. The lack of historical voices from Latin America found in theological scholarship in the United States of America raises concern for the Catholic Church with a large Latino-Latina population. And those numbers range, depending on what studies you're looking at, between 40% and 80%, depending on, again, which studies and what age group. But this is the size of the population in the Catholic Church here in the USA. Although some may think these historical figures should not be considered part of U.S. Latino-Latina theology, Gary Macy argues that, quote, "Whatever can be said of Latino-Latina theology, it cannot be said that it is outside of the mainstream of Western European theological tradition. On the contrary, it is the heir of an ancient tradition that was greatly responsible not only for the preservation of the Western European traditions and learning, but also was one of the most influential creators of that tradition and of that learning. From this historical vantage point, then, Latino-Latina theology is as much or more so a part of the mainstream theology than any other theological grouping, end quote. In light of this recognition, two historical facts must be remembered. One, the Catholic Church in the USA was first brought to the Americas by the Spanish and was translated into a complex matrix of faith and religious experiences. As Macy states, quote, that colonial background was shaped by 16th century Iberian theology, which in turn was influenced by the convivencias, those in Spain, that continued into that century of encounter and mutual discovery, end quote. Two among the oldest Catholic settlements in the United States of America are found in St. Augustine, Florida, and in the American Southwest in Horacetown, Texas. This Catholic history needs to be remembered as we continue Catholic theological scholarship in the United States. Well, Catholic historians of the southwestern United States of America must be remembered as histories rooted in Spain and Mexico. These histories and historical figures should not be considered as belonging only to Latin America again, but also need to be understood as belonging to the United States of America. And that's part of my purpose for doing this theology. I do it to uncover historical roots for deepening our theological reflections. Furthermore, the retrieval of historical voices, especially those of women, remains an important and necessary function for theologies constructed in the 21st century. It's important to have a diversity of historical voices for women in leadership in the Catholic Church. It is also important to exemplify women as leaders throughout the history of the Church. Sor Maria Ana Águeda de San Ignacio renders a voice from 17th and 18th centuries Mexico, which should not be lost in the folds and depths of Christian histories and traditions. She is another voice from a time period when current dominant thought reveres Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz as the prominent, if not only, female writer and theologian of her time and place. Sor Maria Ana adds another original voice to those we know from New Spain and early Mexico. Furthermore, she was both a leader in the establishment of her convent and a theologian as first prioress of her community of Santa Rosa. As leader in the conversion of her beaterio to a convent, she helped realize a goal of a project begun in 1609, and this project was actually started by men, but they decided to use a women's group, a women's beaterio or house of laywomen, to do this project. And what they were doing was trying to establish early ecclesial institutions which belonged only to the Mexican Catholic Church and not to the Spanish Catholic Church. And a large reason for that was, one, to try to split themselves and start working toward independence, but it was also because they were being charged taxes both for the local Mexican Catholic Church as well as taxes back to Spain. And so the convent and the community that Sor Maria Ana eventually helped found was one of the very earliest establishments of just the Mexican Catholic Church. So it did not belong to the Spanish Catholic Church. Maria Ana Águeda's work exists because, unlike Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz at the latter stages of her life, Sor Maria Ana remained in positive relationships with her local ordinary, Bishop Señor D. Domingo Pantaleón Álvarez de Abreu, and Joseph Belido, her confessor, who documented her vida, or life story. Not only did the local ordinary place his seal on her work, he also paid for the professional printing of numerous copies, and 5 copies of her work still exist in public venues with the possibilities of other copies being held in private collections. And so because of this, we're able to have this, and because of the great technology of the printing press. Through the image of Mary's breast milk, Maria Ana explains connections between Mary and each person of the Trinity with particular attention to Mary's relationship with Jesus. In this relationship, the fullness of what is human and divine comes to be known to humanity. Through the spiritual milk, humanity may also come to know and be in union with God. Now, at the time, this is an aside that isn't in here, but we like to think of it as spiritual milk or a spiritual path, but really it was also a popular devotion in which people believed that Mary would show up and nurse them or heal them. And she, Sor Maria Ana, in some of her writings, talks about both the healing of St. Bernard of Clairvaux and St. Augustine reaching out to Mary and her breast milk as well in his conversion. And then she's like, and so in the next town had a visit from Maria de la Leche, and so told me about so-and-so. So it's kind of funny because it's written into her book in this way that she's giving like eyewitness accounts. So it's not just this kind of spiritual note, but they actually believed that Mary could show up physically and nurse people toward union with God, as well as a form of healing. And there's a whole lot of other things I could tell you about, but we can save that for the Q&A or other time. Maria Ana developed her theology of breast milk within each of the 4 books of Las Maravillas. Each contained a specific focus and purpose. In Book 1, she focuses on Mary and Mary's relationship to the Trinity. By situating her work within deep Catholic traditions, she makes direct links between her writing on Mary's breast milk and St. Augustine and Bernard of Clairvaux. Maria Ana also gives numerous pervasive reasons why the reader should follow El Camino de la Leche, and she's convinced that this is like the way to God. In Book 2, Maria Ana uses 15 mysteries of the Rosary to develop a theology of gift, with each decade of the Rosary based on a particular gift. Examples include Mary's children coming to know the fruits of the eternal incarnate Word and matters of justice, one of Maria Ana's main themes throughout Maravillas. The 5th mystery is dedicated to Mary's children coming to know necessary doctrine to find Jesus. Themes of suffering, nudity, and the Holy Spirit are treated as mysteries in Mysteries 7 through 15. Book 3 focuses on the soul's relationship to Christ. In this book, Maria Ana articulates how humanity should measure union with Christ, explaining these measurements such as wisdom. Maria Ana develops a Christology based in a Jesus-Mary humanity model, where the union with Christ results in both relationship and community. Finally, Book 4 names rules of life for El Convento de Santa Rosa. Maria Ana explains the rules of divine love, which a faithful nun in the convent of Santa Rosa should follow. Overall, within Las Maravillas, Maria Ana situates her own theology within extended Christian traditions. In particular, her employment of the image of breast milk places her firmly in the tradition created by both male and female leaders of religious communities through the history of Christianity. And because she uses this, and because of the way that breast milk was employed, and Barbara Reed told us a little bit about that, about the employment of the breast, and that was able to be used as something that came from both male and female sources. That is also a large theme in Christian tradition. So the theme of nursing and breast milk is not something that's just attached to women's body throughout the tradition of the church, which raises all kinds of questions, both about embodiment and about gendering, as well as questions about theology of the body and notions of kenosis, which we can get into later if you want to, or just talk about on the side and during the reception. Little is known about Maria Ana's formal education. We do know, however, she was born of a lower middle class Mexican family, and she was more likely raised in a very fluid Catholic church. Yet one of the things that's really important that her confessor, the Belido who wrote her Vida, points out was that, one, both her parents were married, two, she was of superior intellect, And 3, she heard her calling very early in life, like she was 6 years old. And these things are said in a really grand way, which makes one wonder, was he trying to cover something else? Like, because at the time there were certain very particular aspects of what it was to be a nun and how a woman could enter, and it seems that she was not necessarily the model for this. And she was also not necessarily the model of what it would be seen to be a woman leader of the church. And so to be able to make up for that, the Belido who wrote her Vida seemed to add a little bit extra into it. We call it a pilon where I'm from, just a little extra, a little more. And so she was finally able, with the help of her confessor as well as a couple of other Jesuits after years, to transform her beaterio, which was a house that was built for lay women really to live together. And a large reason that beaterios were built was to keep lay women of a certain class, social class, and a certain level of blood purity away from men from other social classes and other levels of blood purity. So there's racialized notions behind all of this of what's going on. It's not like some great, wonderful perfection of Mexican Catholic, of the Mexican Catholic Church, but there's all kinds of things as happens in all of society. I've gotten kind of a signal that I need to move on. The other important thing about her is that she was actually allowed to enter her beaterio without a dowry. And remember, one of the things that they were trying to do was create convents or institutions that were not tied to the Spanish Catholic Church. And one of the ways that these taxes were paid were through the dowries. And so she was not allowed to enter a dowry, and when the constitutions were written for the convento, she wrote in that women would be allowed to enter without dowries, which was pretty unheard of. I mean, there were a couple of other convents at the time, but not too many. So just kind of as a final note, on May 22nd, 1739, Pope Clement XII issued a papal bull in which he supported the conversion of the Beaterio de Santa Rosa to the Convent of Religiosas Recoletas de Santo Domingo, furthermore stating that the Beatas, who are considered the foundresses, were to take solemn vows with those who enter after this date. And they all took solemn vows 1 year later together. And so on the documentation of the convent, 26 women are actually seen as the foundresses and the leaders, with Maria Ana being the first prioress and the one whose writings we have today. Thank you very much.
Very much for your presentation, inspiring, taking us through the journeys of the newcomers and those who arrived earlier on, and the credo of faith, and those who are joining Catholicism, and men and women, all those dynamics which are critical in, of course, proposing solutions with breast milk. Right, we are welcoming now Sister MarySylvia Nwachukwu, who is a member of the Daughters of Divine Love Congregation in Nigeria. She was a BA in Philosophy and Theology, a licentiate in Sacred Scripture, and a PhD in Biblical Theology. Previously a lecturer at Bigad Memorial Seminary in Enugu, Nigeria, and she's now the Director of Academic Planning at Godfrey Okoye University, also in Enugu. That's in Nigeria. Sister MarySylvia is a member of many international and national biblical and theological associations. She has authored 2 books and several articles, as well as edited many journals. She served as the editor-in-chief of the African Journal of Theology. After 15 years as a lecturer, Sister MarySylvia is extending a teaching ministry to the parish setting, where she leads biblical study for different lay groups. It is in this area that if you haven't had a chance to speak to her, you should, and because she has many stories of his struggles and accomplishment in translating the reality of her knowledge in the communities that are predominantly male and how she's been received. So help me to welcome Sister MarySylvia.
So thank you everyone for the warm reception and for the invitation to join this conversation. Who am I? I've been introduced. MarySylvia Nwachukwu, Daughters of Divine Love Congregation. These are members of my community in Enugu. I live in a formation house, and all these dressed in blue are ready to profess in my congregation this year. I am engaged with DePaul University in Enugu, and these are some of my students. We have about 68% of student population are female, and these are newest faculty. Okay. My paper topic is the Rebekah figure of Genesis 25:27 as a mirror to understanding women's position in relation to leadership to the church in Africa. And I organized my discussion around 5 topics. I begin with setting the goal and task of Ecclesia in Africa, and the conceptual framework of my discussion is that document, Ecclesia in Africa. Then I discuss the cultural context of church in Africa, the church and women issues, before I now begin to analyze the Rebekah figure, who is a model of woman for me, and the conclusion. Church as family. That's the conceptual framework for my discussion on church in Africa. The document that is issued in 1995. Why the family model? That document states it there to direct the goals of evangelization to 3 particular areas: to strengthen bonds of unity among the peoples of Africa, warmth of human relationship and mutual acceptance, and to discourage ethnocentrism and divisive attitudes, which is a very big problem in Africa. And that document also sets the task of theologians, which I think should have to develop a theology of church in Africa as church as family. It must focus on the African family. Listen to the daily stories of life of families, their joys and sorrows. Look at what each entity of the African family is contributing to the well-being of the family, especially look at woman at the heart of the family, and also examine how power structures, how power is structured to maximize goals of Ecclesia in Africa. My second session of my work looks at the context. Which church? It is the Roman Catholic Church in Africa, formed by communities of people of God in different parts of the continent. And this church adapts itself to the set liturgies and theologies of the Roman Catholic tradition. The church in Africa is very Roman and very Catholic. Very rigid rules and rationalistic Western form, but permeated by the African spirit, tropical temperament, spontaneity, dance, and enthusiasm. This church is set in this cultural context where it is influenced by the culture of the context. in the African church community, the cultural context that affects the living of the Christian faith in Africa, we find very resilient aspects of the culture affecting the living of the faith, like where community defines identity and belonging. Family is very central, is of very central concern. So people will be asked to sacrifice their comfort, their joys for the sake of the family. And the family is very patriarchal. And the woman, you see the woman at the center, the heart of the family as mother and caretaker. But we know that the status of women in Africa today is changing rapidly. Modernization is affecting Africa too, and the status of women is changing. And as it is changing in the society, it is also influencing the living of life in the church. Because in Africa, family replicates itself in the church. So people live the church the way they live the family. So to situate my work very well because of this relationship, family and church, I distributed questionnaires, 300, and I got 254 back. And these questionnaires were distributed to people from 2 different cultures. The Igbos of Nigeria with patrilineal culture, and the Akan of Ghana who have matrilineal culture. And among the Igbos, men control property. They are the legal owners and guardians of children, even have the right to restrict their daughters and wives' public activities. So leadership is a sex-based role. Males lead. But among the Akans, there is this institution of Queen Mother, who is the matriarch of every family. But then the Queen Mother appoints males who lead communities and families. So although women have a relatively high status among the Akans of Ghana, inheritance is also given to females. So females inherit, but both males and females inherit through the lineage of their mothers. And this is a result of what I found out through the questionnaires. You can see that the status of women is changing rapidly. My respondents say that about 56% of their parents are both employed. 26% say only their fathers are employed. 12% has only their mothers employed. And among these, the family is a bit very shaky, where the man is not employed and the woman is the breadwinner. And only 6% have both parents not employed. With regard to academic qualification, you also see that these days women are rising in academic status. The fathers have 14% have academic qualification, first degree and above. Mothers 13%, while parents spend their energy and money training their children. And sons 32%, while sons 41% have first degree and above, while daughters have 32%. And this happens also with how people, members of the family, contribute to family finance and welfare. So these days we see women contributing not only in the domestic sphere, but also in economic, education, childcare, and even decision making. So the voices of women are rising gradually. You see contribution to the family, 13% of women are contributing to decision. And then, very interestingly, the males are also joining in domestic, taking care of the family. You see fathers 21%, mothers 36%, and the children join also in taking care of the family. So the result is that women are active at home and at workplace. They contribute to different aspects of the life of the family. Care of the home is growing to be no longer only a woman's business. Members of the family relate better, and they are more open to collaboration and mutual support. But sex-based roles continue in cultural roles that are restricted to men. And even as women are busy outside the family, they feel they cannot leave the domestic sphere to the care of anyone. So women are still there taking care of their families, and their only difficulty is how to strike the balance between work and family demands. So that takes me to the third session of my work, where I went history lane to dig up the age-long history of degradation and oppression of the feminine danger in the entire church. And this is thanks to complication brought about by patristic and medieval church fathers. The most negative ideas on women are found in Tertullian and Thomas Aquinas. I don't like to read this publicly. So for once of time, let's go on. They are not good to be said about our famous saints like Thomas Aquinas and Tertullian. Let's leave them alone. They are also, they are brought up by their own cultures, and there's an extent to which we can fault them. Okay. From the 20th century, we know about the historical and cultural transformations that are going on, especially in the perception of women in the church. And what is happening in the church now is positive, but we can say it is thanks to what is happening in the outside world. So it's like the church is learning from the society. And we see some of these positive changes. Women can now lecture theology in universities, teach catechism, give retreats, serve at Mass. By the way, I was here during Easter, and the church where I worshipped, I didn't see any girl Mass server in that church. And I think Africa is better in this area. Women now participate in pastoral councils and synods, perform functions of lector, and do many other things. Act as parish administrators in areas where there is shortage of priests. But that door remains closed. The ministerial priesthood is shut. Okay, so these are some of the things you see. Even some of the popes we find are more open to these conversations. At the end, they will go back to what tradition has already said. John Paul said it, that the church cannot confer priestly ordination on women. Francis, I find Francis very interesting. And very interesting what he said to some youths on 19th March this year, Feast of St. Joseph. He says, the logic of it's always been done this way is poison. A sweet poison that tranquilizes the heart and leaves you anesthetized so you can't walk. That is the spirit of Pope Francis. Okay, how does this, what is the picture in the church in Africa? As I have said before, the family replicates itself in the church. Respondents to my questionnaire enlist the following among the contributions which women make in the African church. Women provide the largest membership to the church and church choir. So they are mothers to the worshiping community. Church events are organized by them. They take care of priests. They train seminarians, but they don't train sisters. They keep the church clean, take care of church environment. They organize charity donations to the poor, widows, orphans, and the needy. And as a group, they make very substantial financial contribution to the church. These women might not have money But because they are always in their large numbers, very little contributions, they are able to build church projects, and they are active as catechists, lectors, ministers of hospitality, and teachers of catechesis. And they dedicate their lives to church's apostolic work as consecrated women. I had a conversation with the president of the Catholic Women Organization in my diocese, barrister, she's a barrister, Mrs. Salle, here she is. And this woman says, the church in Nigeria is experienced as family, largely family structures replicate in the church. And this is epitomized in the structure of the laity council, which has in its membership every representative component of family members. The chairperson is a member of the Catholic Men Organization, financial secretary is a woman, and so on and so forth. And I asked her, these are, see, they're always dressed in a uniform, and they go in their groups, and that is their strength. I asked her whether a woman could be president of the laity council, and the way she looked at me, as if I was coming from another planet. Sister, what do you mean? She says, we don't contest position with our men. What we strongly contest is injustice, domestic violence, child trafficking, and so on and so forth. But she says they expect something from their leaders. And what they expect is to be carried along. And she says, a priest knows that, priests know that they cannot achieve anything without the support of mothers. And she goes on to say, the mothers, we are the church, we are the neck that carries the head and the body. We give the church the test of family. We are connected to every church member. The men are our husbands, the priest is our son, the rest are our children. The church is our own. So we carry the church just as we carry our families. It is our church. And what women contribute to this church is enormous. This is our office, and all over Nigeria you find such buildings belonging to the CWO in different dioceses, and you never find one built by the men organization. This is their primary school where they train indigent children. And I think we've heard so much about what consecrated women also contribute to the church. I sought to find out some statistics from the Secretariat of the IUSG, International Union of Superior Generals, and interestingly, I find that 80% of churches' missionary work in Africa is a contribution of the consecrated women. We have 157 institutes of women religious founded in Nigeria, in Africa, for Africa, and 90-70 foreign missions working in Africa, and these are all women. My conclusion on contribution of women in the church is that women are in a position of service. They have great enthusiasm for the church. They have no access to church's finance and power, yet the growth and success of local churches depend largely on their contribution. They inspire, motivate, mentor others, and achieve so much within the restraining walls of patriarchy because they create their own sphere of influence. How does Rebekah help me to understand what women are doing in our church today? I look at this woman in the family of Isaac, a family very patriarchal. And Rebekah is the mother of twins, Esau and Jacob, and conventionally the one that leaves the womb first is supposed to be the heir. So Esau was the prospective heir. Isaac's family was like a domestic church with a mission. Isaac inherited the blessing of Abraham, and he was supposed to transfer this blessing to his firstborn son. And the time reached when Isaac should do this, and for Isaac it was a traditional right of inheritance. But on the other side stands Rebekah, who has more knowledge of these two sons of hers. By the way, an oracle, what Rebekah did in this case was conditioned by an oracle that was given to her personally when the children struggled in her womb. And the oracle said, 2 nations are in your womb, 2 peoples, none of you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other. The elder shall serve the younger. Now, Rebekah, I think, thought she should not stand watching while Esau becomes the heir. Because Rebekah knows that Esau is not the qualified son to inherit the blessing. Esau was a man of the field. He chose the wrong profession. He was careless of his birthright. He didn't care. So why would such a one inherit such a blessing that was supposed to be for the whole world? And Esau complicates his case also through his exogamous marriage to foreign women, and these women were a thorn to the flesh of his parents. So Rebekah, I say, contrives the blessing and gives it to the son she thought deserved it. Is Rebekah's action justified? I struggled with this figure, and I know what Rebekah did was very unethical. She deceived her husband. Could we say also that she didn't love Esau? A part of the text says, Isaac loved Esau, and Rebekah loved Jacob. But there is nothing in the text that tells us that Rebekah was in some form of conflict, open conflict with Esau. After all, Esau's best clothes were in her possession. She was just, her goal was to make sure that God's purpose was fulfilled. Because Rebekah had more information probably than Isaac. This oracle was given to her, not to Isaac. So she acted to defend the purpose of God from conventional practice, which was just the right of handing over a blessing to a firstborn son, which Isaac was more prone to do. Isaac was a traditional man. For me, very one-dimensional. He wanted to fulfill tradition. Rebekah was more complex, and under the restrictions of patriarchy, there was no way she could have convinced Isaac to give the blessing to Jacob. So she did what a woman who knows God's plan would do for the family she wanted to defend. Now, Rebekah's action could be seen in the context of the actions of other women in the Bible. I'm looking at Eve, that most controversial figure of the Bible whom everybody is blaming for the wrongs that are done in this world. But I think this is a misinterpretation of Eve. If you look at the narrative of Adam and Eve, you will see that Eve is the one who came very close to what God actually wanted. Because that culpa, that sin, the original sin, is rightly described by Augustine as Felis culpa. If Eve had not done what God intended the first parents to do, Jesus would not have come. You also see Sarah, wife of Abraham, who asked Abraham to send away the maid and her son to the wilderness, an action very evil and unethical. And when Abraham worried, God told him, whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for it is through Isaac that offspring shall be named for you. My friend was also mentioned the Syrophoenician woman who challenged the decision of Jesus to circumscribe his salvific activities to the benefit of Israel alone. Now, Rebekah, Sarah, Eve, and these other women resemble themselves in the ability to contrive a plan of successful action out of restraining and depriving situations. Women could do this because of their multidimensional threats. And I think it is better to look at these women whom the Bible portrays their actions as a bit unethical, even though the narrator does not judge them. And you see families that are very patriarchal, and very subtly, the biblical narrators are telling us to cast our gaze where the narrator is casting it. Look at the actions of these women. They are the ones who are doing exactly what God wanted in that context. And I look at them from the larger picture of God's dealing with creation, what God does from the fringes of human society or from unofficial quarters. And in this bigger picture, God makes human experiences of weakness a preferred backdrop for divine revelation. Rebekah's action gives dramatic impact to the presentation of leadership roles of women in the African church. My conclusion is that the task of Ecclesia in Africa, for theology of family, pastoral attention to the daily stories of modern families, their joys and brokenness, and the changing face of relationships in the family. That theology must look at all these things. Because as church, these stories must provoke the required pastoral action. Women are at the center of the family. They are there as mother, compassionate, and there is this particular trait of woman which I see from all these stories. There is this connectedness of women to God. And story after story, we see that women are more connected to God. I don't know whether to blame this or to give the credit of this to the fact of their being, of their having the task to give birth and to nurture life. In the story of Rebekah, it was in the family of Isaac, it was to Rebekah that God gave the oracle. It was also Sarah who came close to who should inherit Abraham when Abraham was struggling with the fact of Ishmael being his conventional, legitimate firstborn son. And Sarah says no, because Sarah is defending God's promise, the promise that it is through Isaac that inheritance is counted for you. Repeatedly, God said this to Abraham, but Abraham, we see, is always going the conventional way until Sarah stamped her feet on the ground. And we also know that the incarnation mystery of incarnation was revealed to Mary and not to Joseph. So this connectedness of women to God's purpose is very interesting to see in these stories. And I think this is where the power of every woman is coming from, their dedicatedness to the church, what they do, what they realize, all the achievements, even as patriarchy stifles some of their intentions. A church that defines itself as the family of God must recognize this decisive role that women play in the family and in the church. On the admission of women to ministerial priesthood, I think we should leave this agenda to the Holy Spirit. And I'm looking at it this way, that one day, if it is what God wants, the Holy Spirit will treat it the way he treated the case of Cornelius. And one day he would ask Peter, rise and kill. And Peter must kill. Finally, I want to take all these issues of the church, woman, controversy or dialogue back to the more basic question of man and woman relationship. I think this is where all these things are coming from. And this relationship has been dealt with in the Bible. I look at Proverbs chapter 30, verses 18 to 19, which talks of the four most incomprehensible realities of the earth. 3 things are too wonderful for me, 4 I do not understand. the way of an eagle in the sky, the way of a snake on the rock, the way of a ship on the high seas. All these mysteries of the ancient world has been deciphered by science, but one remains a mystery, and that is the way of a man with a girl. And one man was joking during a wedding ceremony where she says, men have found it very difficult to understand women because on the day the woman was being created, the man was sleeping. Thank you for listening.
What do you say? We are back to square one, right? In the morning we're in the Bible, and we think we have left the Bible. We are looking at Ecclesia, and Sister Sylvia linked us back to the first set of panelists. Beautiful, thank you. Now we have time for questions. So feel free to walk to the mic and ask your question. At the very end, we will have time for the panelists to engage and ask each other at least one question and respond to it.
I actually don't have a question. I have a thought, a general thought, and maybe you can help me formulating what would be the question that emerges out of that observation. Because the topic is ecclesiology, right? We're focusing on the church and the model of being a church and kind of define the structure of the church. And before the Second Vatican Council, right, it was a church ad intra, right, turned to itself, and it led to the understanding of church as being focused on clericalism and liturgy, right? And if there was any mission, was to go out to bring people in, and not really a church that was made up of the community. And then with Second Vatican Council, then is a church ad extra, right, that is gonna now go out, and that's an emphasis of Pope Francis now to really go to the peripheries, meet the communities there, and respect their diversity. And I think through all your presentations, you have shown us the Yinyang model, what Maria brought us, and then in the context of Africa, right, and the leadership of women in different ways, and how that helps compose that Pope Francis called the poliedro, the poliedro, you know, that figure that has many faces, but there are different faces, and that is what is going to constitute the multifaceted reality of the church by bringing all these different models. So it's not just one, but then it is centering the power. And what I keep having in mind is in that, the different models, how still get the strategies that women, or the communities, or in communities in partnership, because it's not just women, I think. What strategies do you see as bringing that diversity, that difference into bringing that unity in the church as an ecclesia, right, of the people? Kind of question kind of came out of that.
Well, yeah, decentralization of power is very important. For instance, different regional episcopal conferences should have more power, so that they can address specific contexts, and then down through the national levels. But at the same time, the Vatican, in a way, should it's a center for dialogue with diverse perspectives. I think Pope Francis, in a way, is trying to lessen the centralization in the Vatican. But of course, it's not just a matter of regional thing, because there are other issues like the gender. So yeah, the Vatican II, we became focused on the outward things, but there are so many issues within the church. So that, for instance, in the Philippines, we also talk of intra-religious dialogues. Within Christianity itself, there's a lot of perspectives, and we have to dialogue with each other. Sometimes we are more open dialoguing with other faiths, other religions, but then inside, we're so diverse and they don't talk to each other.
I think the church has always been diverse. So and I think we focus a lot on just certain aspects of the church, and we let people tell our narrative. So one of the things that's really remarkable about this gathering is that we're getting to tell different stories from different perspectives for a number of days. So it starts feeling normal, instead of that the narratives are of certain parts of the church that is what it means to be church. But what it means to be church is it comes from various parts of Jesus' ministry, but it also comes from Pentecost, which is a moment of great diversity. And so, and people who may or may not have been similar to one another, but clearly go out and speak to many different people. And the early church is greatly diverse. So I think the church has always been diverse. I think that we tend to focus on certain narratives over others instead of saying that we are a diverse church. We have always been a diverse church. We have always been an interreligious church. And for some people, that history of interreligiosity is more current in its way of how it's been experienced than for other peoples. So in Asia, in the Americas, we have a different sense of that because of timing and how Christianity spread. But yeah, I think it's about how we tell and understand the narratives and what we see as normative or not, and how we challenge them.
Just to add one thing to what my colleagues have said, we just look at ourselves. Since we came here, we've been appreciating one another, and it has been experience of wonderment, beauty. I think the church is able to do some introspection to really appreciate diversity. That would also influence the way we understand ourselves. There are different levels of diversity. Goes down to what we said about man-woman relationship. The woman is different, and the man sees woman as different. And unless we appreciate difference, then we cannot define who we are. Since after Vatican II, I think the church is being challenged to understand its mission. From the very moment it left, it began to think ad extra. And that is the beginning of many other challenges that the church is facing today. And the more, I think it's a church undergoing purification. And the Spirit helping us, we shall reach there.
MarySylvia, I really appreciate the way you gave me a whole different way of looking at some of those stories of the women, especially in the Old Testament. What I heard you say was that the women chose to follow what they thought was God's will, rather than what the culture demanded. Is that pretty accurate?
Yeah.
Then if you carry that theme of women following God's will rather than the culture demand, how would you carry that into what that would look like today in Africa or any place in the world?
Exactly, that is my door into understanding how women are able to accomplish so much within the context in which their rights are very restricted. They don't have access to power, no access to money, Some of their monies are managed by their husbands, and yet they are able to achieve so much for their families and the church because they have this focus on one thing: God, their children, and their families. So, but that's where I also want us to be looking at. That's very subtly, the Bible brings out this. In traditions that are very patriarchal, you see a subtle appreciation of woman in the very Bible that we say women's voices are not there. I think we should listen more to what they are not saying than to what they are saying. And if we toe that line, we will hear the voices of women from the depths, from silence. From silence, they are speaking very loudly. Silence because the focus is on men and not on them. But yet, God's own perspective is achieved through their actions.
Thank you all for your presentations. I want to do kind of what our moderator was talking about, connect this to this morning, you know. And I don't so much have a question as an observation for everything that we're doing here. And 34 years ago, I became a woman religious in a Catholic community in this country, and I'm ever grateful for the community of sisters with whom I belong. So I don't want this to be a reflection, sort of a dismissal of that, but I would not have survived as a late person in my late 20s if I didn't have that form of living to move into. But I'm aware, sitting here, that we are hearing from lay women and consecrated, if you want to use that term, women religious, together in this forum. And we're talking about daughters of wisdom. So I somehow, looking at the future, on the slide this morning there was that chart with the 3 columns and the 6 layers, and my eyes went to, that's one phrase over here that said, we have to change all paradigms. So I'm wondering why this entire conference is not addressing the role of women and leaders in the church in the context of sexuality, and how that historically has been used by patriarchy to separate the women, the 3 women who are sitting at this table right now, okay? And how do we get past that so that we're all daughters of wisdom? We're not defined by the women that were presented here this morning. It struck me, you know, those were all women leaders in their time, and none of them took a vow of chastity, poverty, or obedience. You know, they were, and how do we get back to that? How do we get back to understanding that we're all these, we all have this role of leadership within the Catholic spiritual community without being defined in that role by whether or not we're active or not active in our sex lives. So I don't have an answer to that question, and I don't expect you to have an answer to that question, but I'm wondering, why do we avoid that question? Why are we not talking about that question? Or if we're, you know, there are a lot of people who want to talk about the issue of celibacy in the priesthood, but we're not talking about the issue of celibacy when it comes to women religious, or, you know, or women in general. I mean, why does that, can we get, all I'm saying is, how can we get that piece of the historical, patriarchal overlay on the role of women in the church into a conversation? I guess that's what I'm trying to do.
Well, this in the Philippines, when I look at the young women who are pursuing PhD in theology, they're now more and more the lay women. Well, it's sad that there are less of the women religious because you also need leadership on their part, but there are more and more young women, so it seems that it's no longer confined to one particular group, that is vow, consecrated. So the future, I think, of feminist theology in the Philippines will be laid in the universities.
I'm not sure I really understood the question, and I think this may still, I'm afraid my answer is going to reify a heteronormative response, so sorry. Because I want us to think a little bit about it. But going back to Sor Maria Ana, and one of the problems of theology and the way that women have been less than the men, and we all know this in this room, is that women are seen as the receptors in the sexual act, and men are the givers. And that's transformed to the notion of grace, where women can only receive grace, but cannot give it in the same way that men can. And this is just a very strict, gross, really. And by that I mean like it's just the blatant sense of how bodily functions have been taken in a heteronormative way to then relate to grace. And one of the things that Sor Maria Ana says is that, she says that the reason that kenosis exists is that God emptied God's self of all of God's godliness to become human, to be filled by Mary's milk. And so the milk becomes that which is giving the grace and which is forming the incarnation. And so then there's this change, and if you just want to go back to, and I said I know I am kind of verifying this whole heteronormativity and mothering, that women need to be mothers, but if we think of that just as a different way, at least it gives us some entry point to start thinking about different ways of how grace is given. And I know we think about that in many ways in this room, but that really is one of the underlying theologies behind much of what we do that isn't stated all of the time, but it's very much fixed culturally.
Well, I actually don't understand what we are doing from your perspective. The way I understand it is according to the saying that you train a woman, you train humanity. You train a woman, you train the whole world. So a woman, for me, just as the word goes, woman includes humanity, both sexes. I wouldn't be discussing it the way you see it. And then from my own background as a biblical scholar, I know where wisdom stays. Wisdom is found outside of the dogmatic part of Scripture. We are looking at lay perspectives, and because we are in that field of the lay perspective, the women shines out, the women shine out. So daughters of wisdom, for me, means that power to, to the energy to be powerful in your situation, irrespective of the constraints that surround your existence. And that's the way I see what is happening.
I just agree. This church teaching on the vocation of women as mothers is something that also affects not only the role of lay women, but even of religious, because then we're not supposed to be there in top leadership, because we have different charism, feminine genius that's related to our capacity to live life. But I think both the lay and the consecrated women are affected by that particular theology.
Yes.
I propose that we take the questions, all the questions, and then give the respondents a chance to just respond in a snap, because we also want their engagement with each other. And looking at the time, probably need to just give questions and take all the questions.
I'd like to thank all three of you for your wonderful presentations. When we come to the topic of ecclesiology, there are many women who have gotten frustrated and left the church. And so I'd like to ask, in each of your contexts, is that happening? I'd be less familiar with how is it manifesting in the Philippines, in Africa. Or are the struggles all with women who try to stay in? Is that more the reality where you are? And I'm fascinated. I'd love to hear more from you, Agnes, about ecclesia in Asia. I know a little bit about it, but I think mostly my question is, do you see the struggles of women? How is it playing out within the church? Are women creating their own spaces to have these kinds of conversations in your contexts? And if so, is that happening in or outside of the ecclesial structures that we have now?
Thank you again for your presentations. My first question, in a way, is related to the previous one. But it's mainly focused in Africa. So this question is for Sister Sylvia, and it's to do with the work on the ground which is done by the circle of African women theologians, and how it dovetails into your own perception of the ecclesia and the place of women's leadership in the church and in society. Number two, again for you, Sister, is to do with the imaging of family and the correlation between the family and the church in a fast-changing society where we probably need to move to incorporate more into the father, mother, children model of family and what that means. So it ties again to the previous question, which challenges us to explore sexuality, not just heteronormativity, but homosexuality on the continent is a big issue. And what is the church's response, and what is the feminist response to that issue, especially modeling when we start modeling the church against the family in a modeling context. And finally, I really loved the Yinyang model, in which pushes us towards some equilibrium, some balance of sorts. And as I was listening to you, I couldn't help thinking, as an African, and reflecting back on Greek but Egyptian mythology, that talks about the same balance, but that balance is not just a given balance. Men, women come into the world with both male and female qualities. However, society is tasked with the job to feminize the woman and masculinize the man, and there are many ways of doing that, but one of the ways of doing it is through cutting the genitalia of men and women as a process of balancing the yin-yang. So I would want to hear what's your response to that, and please, if there's any feedback. There's one more person, and then you can respond.
Thank all of you for wonderful presentations. Just a couple statements. Sister MarySylvia, you one of the statements you made that brought a smile to my face, you said that in Africa, women are experiencing difficulty trying to balance work and family, and I want you to know that's a universal sisterhood problem. The other thing that you said was that within the church, women have accomplished so much without access to power. Now, in all the parishes I've been in, I have never once known a female financial director for that parish. So that's, that's another issue. But also, for the 1,000th time, I will say that if it were not for women, organized religion as we know it today would have died out centuries ago. So that being said, in the U.S. we have a priest shortage. Maybe not so much as you guys don't experience it as much as we have it here. And the reality is we're running out of manpower. I was reading an article a short time ago by one woman activist who said, let's not think so much about the role of pushing to become priest or become a member of the priesthood. Let's not abandon that idea. Let's put it on the shelf for a while. Because what we have here in the United States is we need to protect the life of the church. And one of the proposals that's up is to take the administration of parishes and move it more into the hands of the lay people. You know, and we don't necessarily have to have, quote, a priest to run a parish. You know, yes, we do, you know, for the Eucharist and things of that nature, but to keep the life of the parish running, it's reached a point now where it's critical that lay people take more of an active role. So I will leave it with that as a conversation among people in the United States. Let's start thinking about that, and let's think about how women can move up to some of those roles and really be an active part and be recognized for their work. Thank you.
I realized that was the last question. This is an agenda to it. Just when I had it, she said, we have to realize the priest, somebody else could administer the parish. Basic untruth there. The role of the pastor is not to administer the parish. I take great heart when I go travel around and I see parish bulletins. Whatever the pastor's doing, he might be doing wonderfully pastorally, or he might be all administrative. How many times I'm seeing on the staff the name of a woman, lay or religious, as director of adult formation.
Right, maybe we need to have the panelists respond to that because we are out of our time. Thank you.
Okay, I know some women of my generation, actually they're batchmates in Catholic University. They, well, a number of them have left the church because they were very much involved with the reproductive health bill, and for decades they have always been dialoguing, trying to dialogue with the church until such time that they said there's no more use of dialoguing, so they left the church. But these are former, you know, workers in dioceses and faith-based NGOs. Now about the Clash of Women in Asia, Jean Carapulli will talk more about that. But yeah, it's a space now, where we can be ourselves and develop feminist theology from an Asian perspective. And there are struggles, well, actually, yeah, there was one time we were criticized, you know, online, especially the Indian women, our members who are Indians. But because they're very active in trying to change also the Indian church. Very vocal, so we encounter such problems. But Jane will talk more about that. Now, about circumcision, I'm not so familiar. What I know about circumcision is it's there to control sexuality of women, but I'm not familiar with that ritual to balance the male and the female. But we have other metaphors in Asia that portray that balance. So like the Indonesians, they have the Adarnari, which is half is male and the other half is female. And then in the Philippines, in our creation myth, they both came from the bamboo. Simultaneously, they came out, the man and the woman. So that in a way, it's a different expression of the Yinyang other cultures.
Okay. In my to answer Barbara's question, I don't think there are few voices of women who have risen up to discuss these things and to challenge power structure in the church. But none have tried to lead the church for the powers that are. Because as I said in my paper, the women say, we are the church. So they are not going to leave. And everybody is patient, doing whatever she could do to progress the mission of the church. Other questions? Vivian, I don't think I understand you very well. Women leadership in church and society, especially in relation to such issues as homosexuality, lesbianism. Nobody is discussing these issues openly. And homosexuality is frowned at, lesbianism is frowned at. They are discussed in academic quarters where proceedings of these discussions are shelved and no impact on society because these are not very open issues, even when they exist. So that's my response to that.
As far as women leaving the church, and I think you know some of this context, Barbara, since that was your question, but I live kind of two realities because I live in Dayton, Ohio, and I'm from the border, and my family is on the border, the Mexico-USA border, where the church is growing exponentially. I mean, they can't make actual physical locations fast enough to hold the people. There's the confirmation where my godson was confirmed earlier, and I just got a text that he's finished. There were 97 confirmandi, and that's not the highest amount. There are churches that have 400. So there's that reality, and many of them are women and young women who are actually very active members in the church. In Ohio, the women and my students are leaving the church, and it's around issues. It's not so much around issues of ordination as it is around issues of how women's bodies are viewed, around sexuality, and around procreation, and even the roles of women and expectations of how women live out their lives as Catholic women. So that's what I see mostly is kind of a dichotomy. Now, I'm not saying that one isn't happening, and some of the stuff is happening in both places, but that's the major things I see. And then for the woman who talked about the female financial director in a parish, our mom is actually a female financial director in El Paso, Texas. So there's hope. Yeah, there is.
All right. I'm afraid it's over. Please help me to thank our